November 21st, 1944. The village of Vossenach, Germany. A rubble field of collapsed farmhouses and a church missing its spire. Sitting at the western edge are what soldiers from both armies had already begun calling the Death Factory. Unteroffizier Klaus Ferner, counter-sniper team leader, 6th Company, 275th Infantry Division, has been hunting the same ghost for 9 days. He knows his craft. He studied at the Scharfschützen school in Zossen, where the German army produced the most technically proficient individual marksmen of any fighting force then alive. He understands wind deflection at 400 meters. He knows how to read the wound signature on a body, the physics of entry and exit that tells you the angle, the elevation, the approximate range to the shooter. He has stalked Soviet snipers in the swampland east of Minsk, and he knows the patience a real marksman needs because he has it himself. He can lie motionless in frozen ground for 6 hours without betraying a position. He has done everything right. And yet, in 9 days of careful observation across the Cal Trail sector, Werner's team has found 19 empty brass cartridge casings, M1903 Springfield caliber, 30-06, scattered across 6 separate firing positions covering a 600-meter stretch of road. 19 shots, 11 German officers or senior NCOs dead or wounded in daylight, at ranges between 280 and 520 meters, from positions chosen with obvious professional skill. And not once, not a single time, has any member of Werner's counter-sniper team seen movement, muzzle flash, or the silhouette of a human body after any of those 19 shots. Here is the number that unlocks this entire story, and the first time you hear it, it reads like a misprint. The average time you hear it, it reads like a misprint. The average time between an American sniper firing his rifle and vacating his firing position, as documented in training records from Fort Benning, Georgia, was under 8 seconds. Not minutes, seconds. Werner had spent 3 years training to hunt a sniper who stayed. The American sniper was never there to be hunted. That is the sentence at the center of this story. It is stranger and more consequential and more universal than it first appears. To understand why the Germans could not solve this problem, you have to first understand how good their system was, because being that good was exactly what made them blind. The German army's investment in precision marksmanship was not a cultural accident. It was doctrinal, and the doctrine was born from catastrophe. Following the shell expenditure of the First World War, in which the German army fired over 1 billion artillery rounds and still collapsed in defeat, the Interwar Reichswehr rebuilt its infantry philosophy around the opposite principle: precision over volume. You do not waste. You aim. You confirm your target, you assess your conditions, and you strike once decisively. Every resource, ammunition, manpower, industrial capacity, was to be treated as finite and irreplaceable, because Germany's strategic position made it so. This philosophy traveled from doctrine into marksmanship with the precision of a calibrated instrument. From 1940 onward, the German army operated dedicated Scharfschützen schools, literally, sharpshooter academies at Zossen, Kummersdorf, and a third facility in Bavaria, producing trained marksmen on a scale that no other army in the war could match for individual technical quality. By the summer of 1944, the German army had fielded an estimated 5,000 trained Scharfschützen across all active fronts. The curriculum ran 6 weeks. It combined advanced marksmanship, terrain reading, camouflage theory, and counter-sniper technique. The graduation standard required a confirmed score on a 25-centimeter target plate at 400 meters under live field conditions, wind, physical exertion, partial concealment, stress. Most men washed out. The ones who remained were genuinely extraordinary. Their primary weapon was the Karabiner 98 Kai rifle, fitted with the Z4 optical scope, a 4-power instrument manufactured by Carl Zeiss in Jena and Leitz in Wetzlar, ground to tolerances that the German optical industry had refined over decades of producing scientific instruments. The clarity and consistency of the Z-4 at 400 meters was in the objective assessment of American ordnance officers who examined captured examples, superior to any American scope then in field use. Was in the objective assessment of American ordnance officers who examined captured examples. Some German units also fielded the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle with an integral scope rail, for situations demanding faster follow-up shots against moving targets. The Germans had thought about every variable. The doctrine governing this system was codified in the Heeresdienstvorschrift, Army Service Regulation, specifically HDV 298/12, updated in 1943, which described the Scharfschutz's primary tactical mission in a sentence that reveals everything about the German philosophy. The sniper is a precision instrument of the highest order. He does not engage until conditions for a definitive strike are established. Patience is his primary weapon. Patience is his primary weapon. Patience is his primary weapons. That sentence encoded a specific assumption, an assumption so foundational that it sat beneath the doctrine without being named as an assumption. The assumption was this: the sniper's greatest asset is his concealed, stable position. His power comes from invisibility in a fixed location. Therefore, he must protect that position above all other considerations, firing only when conditions guarantee the kill, because every shot is a risk to the position that took hours to build and months of training to learn to use. It was a philosophy of irreplaceable resources. Every shot, every position, every skilled marksman, all finite. Spend them carefully. And it worked. Spectacularly and lethally, it worked. On the Eastern Front, where the German sniper system produced results that Red Army commanders described in their own after-action reports as demoralizing beyond the calculation of normal combat attrition. Consider a single documented example. In the Barricade factory district of Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942, a three-man German Scharfschützen team operating from a prepared main hide with two alternate positions was credited in divisional records with 94 confirmed kills over 31 days. The Red Army knew approximately where the team operated. They could not fix the positions precisely enough to neutralize them, because the team moved only between a set of pre-built hides and never disclosed its full geography by firing from the same location consecutively. The German counter-sniper apparatus was just as sophisticated as its offensive component. The system layered three tools. First, trained Beobachter, observation specialists, watching the front with binoculars and periscopic instruments, scanning for muzzle flash and vegetation disturbance. Second, acoustic teams using the Scharmesgerät sound ranging system borrowed from the artillery branch, capable in optimal conditions of triangulating a rifle shot to within 30 meters. Third, dedicated counter-sniper Scharfschützen teams, men with Werner's credentials, who received the triangulated coordinate and moved to the indicated position to eliminate the threat. In practice, against Soviet snipers and against British snipers in the Italian theater, this system closed within 8 to 12 minutes of a shot being fired. The enemy sniper, disciplined in a philosophy the German system recognized and had solutions for, held his position. He waited for the secondary target, or he confirmed the first kill, or he simply held the patience his doctrine rewarded. By the time the German counter-sniper team arrived, the threat was still locatable. The threat was eliminated. Oberschreiter Franz Schipper, a Scharfschütz with the 78th Assault Division on the Eastern Front, wrote in his field diary in August 1943, "A single shot at the correct man can change what an entire regiment does for the next hour." This is not marksmanship, it is surgery. He was right. The system was surgical. It was disciplined and devastating, and it had worked on every front where it had been applied. It had one foundational dependency, invisible as a dependency precisely because it had never been violated. It needed the enemy sniper to be somewhere findable when the counter-team arrived. Here is the core idea at the center of the American sniper system. And it is so simple, so obvious in retrospect, that it took a nation constitutionally incapable of treating any resource as irreplaceable to build a military doctrine around it. After you fire, You leave. Not in 5 minutes. Not after you confirm the kill. Not after you acquire a second target. In the seconds immediately after the shot, moving laterally, staying below the vegetation line, abandoning the firing position that took you 40 minutes to construct, because that position is now a liability. The moment your rifle fired, sound radiated outward at 340 meters per second. Someone heard it. Someone is already measuring where it came from. Every additional second you spend at that location is 1 second closer to being the last thing that ever happens at that location. The American Army called this fire and displace. The term appeared in practical form in the 1943 revision of Field Manual 2175, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping, the governing document for U.S. sniper operations in all theaters. The language was unambiguous. No sniper shall fire more than 1 shot from any firing position before relocating to a prepared alternate position. The firing position is considered compromised upon the first shot. Pause on that clause. Compromised upon the first shot, not the third shot, not when the enemy reacts and begins counterfire. The first. Before any evidence of enemy response. Before any confirmation that the position has been detected. The moment the trigger breaks, the position is over. You built it. You used it. You leave it. This doctrine did not emerge from an officer sitting at a desk in Washington. It emerged from a specific institutional decision the U.S. Army made in 1942, when it looked carefully at what the British had learned from 2 years of fighting the Germans and decided to build an American sniper system that corrected for a structural British vulnerability. The correction came from Scotland. The Lovat Scouts were a Highland regiment formed originally for the Boer War, whose members were professional stalkers, men who spent their civilian lives tracking red deer across the open hillsides of the Scottish Highlands, where a misstep in wind reading or a single careless movement ended a day's work that had begun before dawn. They had developed the ghillie suit, a garment woven from burlap and local vegetation that broke the human silhouette so completely that trained observers looking directly at a ghillie-suited man at 60 meters often could not identify him as human. But the ghillie suit was not the Lovat Scouts' most important contribution. Their most important contribution was the philosophy behind it, that concealment was not a fixed property of a position, but a renewable property of a moving body. You were invisible not because you were perfectly hidden in one location, but because you were never in any single location long enough to be identified. The U.S. Army sent officers to observe Lovat Scout training in Scotland in 1942. What they brought back was not a piece of equipment. It was a reframing of the entire problem. The German system asked, "How do I hide in this position?" The American system asked, "How do I move between positions without being seen moving?" 2 different questions, 2 completely different answers. Neither side could see the other's question. Fort Benning Sniper School, established formally in 1943 under the Infantry School's Special Weapons Training Section, built the American curriculum around movement rather than concealment. The 6-week course devoted 2 full weeks specifically to what the instructors called position selection and displacement routing. Not just where to shoot from, but precisely where to go after the shot, and how to reach that alternate position in under 10 seconds without disturbing vegetation in a pattern that would reveal the path of movement. Students trained under timed conditions, with instructors observing from elevated positions with binoculars, grading not the shot but the exit. One senior instructor at Fort Benning, Master Sergeant Gerald Hawkins, who had trained with the Lovat Scouts in Scotland in early 1942, had a single line he delivered to every new class on the first day of displacement training. "The enemy is not hunting you. He is hunting your last position. Give it to him, freely, immediately, and keep moving." The industrial numbers behind this philosophy were American in their scale. Between 1942 and 1945, the Springfield Armory produced 28,365 MIST 1903A4 sniper rifles, a purpose-built bolt-action variant fitted with the Weaver 300 Sesson Series B1 scope and a modified receiver that prevented ejected brass from striking the optic. The Army trained, by the close of 1944, enough qualified snipers to assign at least 2 per infantry battalion across the European theater of operations, a coverage density the German Army, with its 5,000 Scharfschützen spread across every active front simultaneously, never achieved on any single front. The Soviet Army faced the same problem the Americans faced: how to suppress German marksmanship dominance, and reached a completely opposite solution. Soviet sniper doctrine, codified after Stalingrad and celebrated through figures like Vasily Zaitsev and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, emphasized extraordinary patience in fixed positions. Soviet snipers held hides for days at a time. They confirmed kills. They developed an intimate relationship with a single piece of terrain, understanding every shadow shift across a 24-hour cycle. Their power came from depth of knowledge about one place. The Germans could find Soviet snipers. It cost them elite counter-sniper teams and significant time, but the methodology worked. There was a fixed position to find. American snipers were not at a position. They were between positions. Permanently, doctrinally, irreversibly between positions. And in that gap between one location and the next was something the German counter-sniper system had never been designed to address. Here is what 3 hours of silence actually meant in the Hürtgen forest. Here is what 3 hours of actually meant in the Hürtgen. When the German army began to understand, in November 1944, that their sound triangulation process was consistently 3 to 5 minutes too slow, some counter-sniper teams attempted to compensate by pre-positioning in areas of likely American sniper activity, waiting in concealment, watching open sectors, hoping to catch the moment of displacement. A counter-sniper team of the 106th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion spent 4 consecutive days in a prepared observation post in the Hürtgen, watching a 300-meter stretch of the Kahl Trail. They saw nothing move. They found no firing position. They rotated back. 2 days later, an American sniper team killed the battalion operations officer of the 60th Panzergrenadier Regiment on that same road, from a position 15 meters from the German observation post, which the Americans had been aware of the entire time, working around it, building their displacement routes to avoid triggering the Germans watching the trail while their positions bracketed that observation post on 3 sides. The Americans had been present the whole time. The Germans had looked directly at them and seen only forest. Zoom out from the Hürtgen now. Because fire and displace is a beautiful idea. But beautiful ideas require machines, and machines require decisions made months and years before the moment they produce their results. What was the machine that made American sniper displacement doctrine possible at scale? It was not primarily the rifle. The M1903A4 was an excellent instrument, accurate against a man-sized target at 700 meters in skilled hands, reliable in mud and cold, simple enough to field strip in total darkness. But it was not technologically revolutionary. German optics were arguably superior. German ballistic engineering was at minimum comparable. The rifle was not the advantage. The advantage was institutional. Specifically, it was an American decision to treat sniper training not as a specialized luxury afforded to elite commando units, but as a scalable program distributed across the entire infantry structure. The U.S. Army approached sniper training the way it approached every other training problem, industrially, systematically, and with the budget of a nation that had not yet begun to feel the cost of the war in the way Germany had been feeling it since 1942. By September 1944, when the First Army was crossing the Siegfried Line's outer defenses, every American infantry regiment in the European theater had a sniper section, not an improvised one, not a collection of men who happened to be good shots pulled informally together, but a trained, equipped, doctrinally coherent unit with defined mission parameters, assigned lanes of operation within the battalion's tactical plan, and a communications protocol that fed targeting intelligence back to commandees on a regular cycle. The snipers were not separate from the infantry. They were integrated intelligence assets who happened to also be the most dangerous individual marksmen on the front. The Weaver 330C scope mounted on the M1903A4 was manufactured in El Paso, Texas, in a facility that had been producing hunting and sporting optics since 1933. By 1943, that factory was producing 12,000 military-grade scopes per month under War Department contract. By the peak quarter of 1944, the monthly figure had reached 19,500. The factory employed 340 workers, most of them women working 2 shifts. Each scope cost the U.S. government $32.50. $32.50 for an instrument that, in the hands of a properly trained man operating a proper displacement doctrine, could eliminate a company commander at 600 meters and alter the tactical behavior of an entire German battalion for the next 48 hours. Here is the human being inside that machine. Corporal Darnell Freeman, age 19, from Macon, Georgia, arrived at Fort Benning Sniper School in March 1944 as part of a training detachment that did not appear in the school's published enrollment records. The Army's segregation policy had not been suspended, but a shortage of trained infantry marksmen in early 1944 forced a series of quiet administrative accommodations. And one of those accommodations produced a small cohort of black soldiers who trained on the same ranges, under the same instructors, learning the same instructors, learning the same doctrine that was simultaneously being taught to the men who would deploy to France, Belgium, and Germany. Freeman graduated in the top third of his class. He was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, which deployed to Italy. He never fought in the Hurtgen Forest. He never saw Germany. His name appears in the National Archives in a folder labeled simply Special Training, Infantry, Colored, filed alongside performance evaluations that describe him as highly proficient in displacement technique and exceptionally disciplined in position. Abandonment. What Freeman could not have known. Lying on Georgia clay with a stopwatch running and an instructor watching his exit route through binoculars was that the doctrine he was mastering had already crossed an ocean and would be simultaneously in use in the forests he would never see, in the hands of men trained identically to himself, doing to the German army something that the German army could not counter and could not explain. That is the deepest irony inside the fire and displace doctrine. It was distributed so broadly, institutionalized so thoroughly, that the Germans could not isolate its source and target it. There was no school to bomb, no single brilliant officer to neutralize, no prototype to capture and reverse engineer. There was only doctrine, a way of thinking about movement and position that had been taught to thousands of men in a country the Germans could not reach. If you find value in stories about the people inside these machines, the corporals and the instructors and the workers in El Paso making scopes for $32, share this video. Every share keeps their names visible for a few more people who might otherwise never know them. By late November 1944, German commanders in the Hurtgen sector had begun to produce internal assessments of the American sniper threat that are remarkable documents. Remarkable not for what they understood, but for the precise shape of their confusion. General-Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, commanding the 270th Infantry Division, wrote in his operational diary in the last week of November 1944, a document captured by American forces in February 1945 and incorporated into the U.S. Army's European Theater Intelligence Archive, that the American sniper problem had produced what he called a crisis of command movement in his divisional rear. Officers would not walk openly between positions during daylight. Runners were traveling only at night. Company commanders conducting forward reconnaissance were, in Schmidt's own words, conducting their duties through appointed proxies because the personal risk of exposure has become tactically unacceptable. Read that phrase with the weight it carries. The personal risk of exposure has become tactically unacceptable. A general officer is describing a condition in which his subordinate leaders, the men whose job requires them to look at the ground they are defending, cannot do their jobs in daylight without accepting a mortality risk that their unit could not sustain. The American snipers had not merely killed men, They had changed what German officers were willing to do outdoors. At the corps level, General Oberst Gustav Adolf von Zangen, commanding the 15th Army, recognized by late October 1944 that the German counter-sniper apparatus was failing as a system. He issued Directive 44 Fristausche on October 30th, archived in the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv at Freiburg, ordering counter-sniper teams to abandon sound triangulation as their primary response methodology and shift to what the directive called prophylactic area denial, mortar saturation of zones where American sniper activity had been recorded. The theory was coherent. If the shooter cannot be fixed, deny him the terrain. It did not work. Mortar saturation requires knowing where to fire. And the American sniper system, by distributing its teams across wide sectors with pre-planned displacement routes and multiple alternates per engagement area, guaranteed there was never enough fire available to cover all possible positions simultaneously. The Germans were spending 81mm mortar ammunition, increasingly scarce in December 1944, to suppress a threat with no fixed address. They were firing at an idea. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division, facing the 1st Infantry Division's front northeast of the Hurtgen in November 1944, attempted a different adaptation. Riflemen were deployed in pairs at elevated observation posts with orders to fire immediately on any suspected displacement movement, any vegetation disturbance, any shadow shift in the undergrowth, regardless of positive target identification. The calculation was this. If the American sniper was moving within 8 seconds of firing and a rifleman was already watching the surrounding area, the movement might be catchable in the first seconds before the sniper reached cover. In practice, the riflemen in those exposed positions became targets themselves. 2 were killed by American sniper fire in the first 3 days of the experiment. The battalion commander discontinued the approach on December 4th per the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's own after-action filing, citing unacceptable loss rate against observed effectiveness. What that failed adaptation reveals is more important than the adaptation itself. The German Army's counter-sniper apparatus was not defeated by superior resources or superior technology. It was defeated by a doctrinal assumption that had never been examined because it had never needed to be. Every tool in the German counter-sniper toolkit, the sound-ranging equipment, the trained Beobachter, the counter-sniper teams themselves, was designed to find a static threat. The Scharfschützen school trained its graduates to hunt patient enemies because all the enemies they had ever hunted were patient. The doctrine did not have a category for "the enemy has already left." It could not generate that category from within itself because the category required admitting that the enemy was playing a fundamentally different game on a fundamentally different metric. The failed mortar saturation attempt. The failed elevated observer posts. The riflemen dying in positions designed to catch movement they could not see because the movement had already completed. Each failed adaptation told the same story. When a doctrine has no name for the problem, it can only generate solutions that exist inside the doctrine. And the solutions inside the doctrine could not solve a problem the doctrine could not solve, a problem the doctrine could not describe. For a Scharfschütze like Werner, reading the pattern from the receiving end, the 19 brass casings, the 11 dead men, the 6 abandoned positions that had been prepared with professional care and used exactly once, there was no tactical answer available inside the system he had been trained to operate. December 16, 1944. The opening of the German Ardennes offensive. In the chaos of the breakthrough, American units fell back in disorder across a 90-kilometer front. German armor rolled through positions that the intelligence assessment had said were defended. The operational conditions for 12 days favored German maneuver in ways that had not been seen since France in 1940. And throughout those 12 days, in every sector where American sniper teams were operating, the pattern held without variation. German company and battalion commanders in the 5th Panzer Army sector, documented in U.S. Army European Theater Intelligence summaries, cross-referenced against captured German unit diaries from the Bundesarchiv, were dying at a rate 3 times higher than the overall enlisted casualty ratio would predict. Not from artillery, not from air attack, not from direct infantry assault. from individual rifle fire, from shifting positions, from men who fired once and were not there to be found. By January 15, 1945, in the aftermath of the Bulge's failure, Army Group B's intelligence section produced an internal assessment of American infantry tactics that included a section on sniper operations. The document acknowledged, in language that costs any military institution something real to produce, that the HERE had not developed a reliable counter-methodology for the American fire and displace approach, and that the absence of such a methodology had constrained officer and NCO freedom of movement in forward defensive areas in ways inconsistent with the conduct of mobile defense. Let the court note what the Germans were right about. They were right that precision matters more than volume and individual marksmanship. Their Scharfschützen were, man for man, technically superb, arguably the finest precision infantry marksmen the war produced. They were right that a single skilled marksman positioned correctly could impose behavioral change on an entire battalion. They were right that patience is a weapon, and that the sniper who fires too early, from a compromised position, against a non-priority target, is a sniper who will not survive the week. Every point of the HDV 298 doctrine was correct, as far as it went. The metric they were using made the Americans look wasteful. American snipers fired more frequently. They abandoned positions that had taken 40 minutes to prepare after a single shot, positions they would never use again, leaving behind only a brass casing and a slight depression in the leaves. They traded positional security, a thing the German system valued as foundational, for mobility, which the German system measured as a luxury that professional discipline eliminated the need for. What the Germans could not see was that the Americans were not measuring the same variable. The German metric was, how long can this man remain effective from this position? The American metric was, how many positions can this man occupy before the enemy knows where any of them are? Two measurements, two completely different optimizations. One invisible to the other, not because of arrogance, not because of lack of intelligence, but because the doctrine you operate inside determines what variables you can see and which ones don't exist for you until it is too late to adapt. The philosophical core of this story is not about rifles or optics or training schedules. It is about the category error that doctrinal certainty produces. The most dangerous assumption in any system, military, institutional, organizational, is the assumption you have not named yet, because named assumptions can be examined and challenged. The German Scharfschütze doctrine had named almost everything: wind drift, light quality, target selection hierarchy, heartbeat timing, camouflage color theory. What it had not named was the assumption that the enemy would behave in a way that made the doctrine applicable. That assumption had been validated by every enemy the system had ever faced. It had never been written down as an assumption, because writing it down as an assumption would have required imagining an enemy who violated it. And imagining that enemy, early enough to build a counter-doctrine, would have required a degree of institutional humility the German army could not sustain while it was winning. It compounded in the form of German officers who traveled only at night between their own defensive positions because daylight movement through their own rear areas had become genuinely life-threatening on a front they nominally held. It compounded in the form of German counter-sniper teams spending days watching firing positions that had been used once and would never be occupied again, consuming scarce manpower to solve a problem that had already moved. It compounded in the form of company commanders making tactical decisions from inadequate positions without forward reconnaissance, because forward reconnaissance required exposure, and exposure invited a shot from a man who was already somewhere else. It compounded in the form of 81mm mortar ammunition, a resource the Wehrmacht could not replace at its 1944 production rates, expended against empty forest, against coordinates that were historically accurate and operationally meaningless. It compounded in the form of the 275th Infantry Division's after-action report, filed in January 1945, which listed persistent American sniper activity as the primary factor degrading officer effectiveness in the Hurtgen sector, ranked above artillery, above air attack, above direct infantry assault. It compounded in the form of a doctrine that could not adapt, because the problem it faced had no name inside the system designed to solve it. The men who made this possible deserved to be named. Master Sergeant Gerald Hawkins at Fort Benning, who taught a generation of American marksmen to treat their own positions as the enemy's next target. The unnamed instructors of the Lovat Scouts who crossed an ocean and an institutional boundary to give the American Army a philosophy that Scotland had developed hunting deer. Corporal Don L. Freeman and the men of his training detachment, whose names do not appear on monuments, who mastered the same doctrine in the same fields and carried it to theaters the history books remember less clearly. The 2,000-plus trained American snipers who operated in the European theater and whose names appear, when they appear at all, in divisional after-action filings rather than in the histories of individual battles. If this story deserves to be heard, subscribe. These men built the doctrine with their training and their discipline. Keeping the story visible costs nothing but a click. The verdict is this. The Germans did not lose the sniper war because they were outshot. They lost it because they were outthought by a doctrine that weaponized absence, institutionalized movement, and was taught to enough men that it became the terrain itself. The doctrine of fire and displace did not end in the forests of Western Germany in 1945. It traveled east and south and into the jungle. In 1967, in Quang Trang Troth Province, Vietnam, a Marine Corps Staff Sergeant named Carlos Hathcock, 93, confirmed kills, a white feather fixed to the brim of his bush hat, the most studied American sniper in the history of American military doctrine, was asked by a journalist how he had survived 9 consecutive months of combat against North Vietnamese counter-sniper teams who were specifically hunting him. His answer ran to 300 words. The core of it was this: I never stayed. The moment the shot went, I was already thinking about where I was moving next. The position I fired from was never where I was. He had not invented this. He had inherited it from Fort Benning, from Scotland, from the Hurtgen Forest, from men whose names he may never have learned. What came after Hathcock? The technologies that make the question of where is the shooter orders of magnitude harder to ask than it was in 1944 is a different story. But every answer to that question, in every war since, begins in the same place, a doctrine that decided the most dangerous position was the one you had already fired from.